let's talk about disjunctive clauses. Now, before we begin this discussion of what we consider disjunctive, let's refresh ourselves on what we mean by conjunctive. This relates to an important grammatical term, conjunction. Conjunction is any kind of a word that joins other words or phrases or clauses. As some of you may remember if you were ever exposed to Schoolhouse Rock, conjunction, junction. So conjunctions in Hebrew, really the main one that you see most frequently joining words, phrases, and clauses is the vav conjunction. Okay? And in the term conjunction, you see these two roots in Latin, junction having to do with the idea of joining and con with. So joining together words, phrases, and clauses. That's what vav does. And so vav will always conjoin two different ideas. That's just in the nature of the vav. And accordingly, this is the conjunction that we think of as meaning and, but, or. Any of these typically correspond to vav. Most frequently, it's easy for beginning students of Hebrew to think of it as the word and. Then later in our first semester, after we had been introduced to the vav conjunction, we met a different variety of that vav, and that was vav patach dagesh. This is also still a conjunction. So keep that in mind. Even this vav, though it looks a little bit different in terms of its pointing, is still a conjunction. It joins up clauses. But this vav had a special name. We called that the vav consecutive. Consecutive. You can even think of it as a sequential vav. That is to say, this is the vav that you find predominating in most biblical Hebrew narratives. And so this vav you'll see all over the place. If you recall from our first semester, this vav is to be attached to preterite verbs. Remember, preterites are simple past verbs. So you see it all over the place. For example, very frequently in this word, vayomer. Then he said, vayomer. And you'll see it with any number of other verbs as well. But it shows typically the idea of one action after another. Then he did this, then he did that, and so on and so forth. So that's the vav consecutive, but it is still a conjunction. It joins, in this case, it joins clauses. Separate parts of a sentence which have a full thought, a full subject and verb idea to them. Now, as we begin lesson 21, you have been introduced to what Ross calls vav disjunctive. The basic idea here being that even this vav, which is also a conjunction, nevertheless functions in a different kind of manner. It doesn't seem to so much join up words and phrases and clauses together as much as cause a sort of break in the flow. A break in the flow. Hence the name disjunctive. These are vavs that seem to disjoin two clauses and make them somewhat unrelated to each other. But there's a problem with this kind of nomenclature. The vav itself is never really disjunctive. There's nothing inherent in a vav that will make it somehow disjunctive and to break the flow of the narrative. The real issue here, instead of calling it a vav disjunctive, I would simply talk, as you see at the top of the heading here, about disjunctive clauses. These are clauses that, like most clauses that are in the Hebrew narratives, they begin with a vav. But what makes them disjunctive, what makes them disjointed and break the flow of the narrative is these are vavs that are not like your vav consecutive. In other words, they do not begin with the typical formula, like I said earlier, vayomer, or what we'll encounter early on in the Jonah narrative, va yakom, then he got up, and va yered, and then he went down, and so forth. These are the typical preterite verbs, although these are two weak verbs, so their form should not exactly look that familiar. Nevertheless, they all begin with that vav consecutive element. I hope you're seeing that. There's the vav and the patach and the dagesh in the next letter. And when you see that combination, you always know that what it's attached to must be a preterite, a past tense, simple past tense verb. And this is how most of the Hebrew narratives flow. They are carried along by this kind of sequence. Vav consecutive followed immediately by a preterite. And then a few words later, another vav consecutive attached to a preterite, time and time again. And this is how the Hebrew narratives are structured. A person does something and then moves on to the next thing. These are in sequence. But what if the author wanted to break that sequence for a moment? There could be a number of reasons for this. Maybe the author wants to give some background information. Or maybe the author wants to give some contrasting information. Well, this is when somebody will use disjunctive clause, a disjunctive clause. And here's how that works. In fact, I'll give you the earliest example that we have in the Hebrew Bible. Technically, the very first example is the opening to Genesis 1, verse 1. You have Bereshit bara Elohim. Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created. And you know how the rest of it goes. Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created. That is how the narrative of Genesis begins. But even this beginning cannot be consecutive in nature. It is a disjointed phrasing because this is the beginning of something. So it's not connected to anything preceding it. There is no narrative leading up to this narrative. This is the very beginning of the narrative, not only of Genesis, but of the whole Bible for us. And so it begins with a disjunctive clause. So one way to think of disjunctive clauses is that they are clauses, they can be clauses that simply do not begin with a vav at all. They can begin with a prepositional phrase like you find here or some other element. But the most frequent form of disjunctive clause that you will find in the Hebrew Bible is a vav that is not attached to a verb, but is attached to any other sort of element, most typically a noun. The first example of this kind of disjunctive clause in the Hebrew Bible is found in Genesis 1, once again, in the second verse. So after it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, then there is this next statement, Ve haaretz. Ve haaretz haita. The earth was. Tohu vavohu. Tohu vavohu. Okay, this is the famous phrase, the earth was formless and void. All right, so v'ha'aretz, you should recognize that first element, the earth. Haita, this is a weak verb, and we're going to be getting more into these this semester. But it is a weak verb from haya, hey yod hey. It's the verb to be. So the earth was tohu vavohu, formless and void. It's a complicated mess, the kind of history behind interpreting these words, but that's not what our focus is today. So that said, notice how this next phrase in Genesis 1 begins. It doesn't begin with a vav consecutive. You might expect something instead more like this. Va tehi. Va tehi ha aretz. then the earth was, or and the earth was. But that's not how Genesis 1 verse 2 begins. It begins in this other fashion that I first laid out for you here. It begins with a vav, like you expect at the beginning of most clauses in Hebrew. But this time, the vav is attached to a noun and not a verb. And so this is the most typical way in which you will encounter, or the most typical form in which you will encounter a disjunctive clause. It will most typically be a vav attached to some element other than a verb. And this is, even though it is still a conjunction, so we're still talking about a conjunction here that joins clauses together, it nevertheless joins them in what we might call an awkward way, because it's most natural in Hebrew to join, at least Hebrew narratives, to join clauses together with a vav attached to a verb. And so when you encounter this kind of combination, it would grab the original reader's attention. And instead of simply translating this as, and the earth was formless and void, it might make better sense, especially to capture the idea here of this is not a normal sort of phrasing, but this is disjointed from the rest, and it breaks the flow, to translate it something like, now the earth was formless and void. So this is an example of a disjunctive clause that is used in this particular instance more to give background information. So background. And there's another category of these disjunctive clauses that gets called parenthetical. In other words, this would be the equivalent of parentheses. Honestly, the difference between the two can be hard to establish, and any number of us can debate this for ages. But one way or another, both background and parenthetical kind of clauses amount to the same thing. They are giving the reader background information that somehow breaks the flow of the rest of the narrative. And so sometimes that might be, like in English, something we break off with ellipses, or that we separate with parentheses, and at the very least with commas around the clause. So that's what's happening here. As you begin Genesis chapter 1, the first element is given, which itself, like I said earlier, is disjoined because it's opening up the narrative. It's not connected to anything prior, and that is the statement, in the beginning, God created. But once that first element has been laid out, even after that, there is a break in the flow. There is this disjunctive clause, v'ha'aretz haita tohu vavohu, with the idea being that even as this narrative is just getting off the ground, the reader has to be given a little bit more background information. And so you might translate this, like I said, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the earth, you might even insert, at least just for understanding the concept here, some sort of a side statement like, now the earth, mind you, was formless and void at that time. That's basically what the writer is doing here. He is giving us something that is backgrounding. It's laying the scene for the rest of that narrative, which is about to flower before us. And then the narrative picks back up when the author resumes with a vav consecutive attached to a preterite. And in this case, it's that very frequent verb, vayomer. Then he said, then God said, let there be light, if you recall. So this, once we encounter the typical vav consecutive, which dominates Hebrew narratives, that's telling us that we are jumping back now into the flow of simple past narration. Then God said, let there be light. Then there was light. Then God saw, and so forth. So this, when you see that vav consecutive that we learned about last semester, that's our indication that we are in the flow of the narrative. But this disjunctive phrasing, this disjunctive clause, where you encounter a vav attached to something that is not a verb, is the indicator that you are dealing with a break in the flow, and the author wants to tell you something different, something to get your attention. So, like I said, that can be background information or parenthetical if you like. It can also be contrastive information. And let me give you an example of that. The example that I'll use comes from Genesis 4 in the middle of verse 2. And this is the very beginning of the Cain and Abel narrative. And we begin with a preterite, which is normal. Like I said, the majority of verbs in Hebrew narratives are preterite verbs, which are immediately preceded by the vav consecutive. Now, in this case, I want to point out that there is no dagesh in the yod. That is because of the Skinnem Levi principle. This is a particularly weak verb. This is from Haya, once again, and we'll get into that later this semester. It just looks strange in the Hebrew. It's an exceptional case. But because of the Shava under the Skinnem Levi letter, we don't see the dagesh that we would normally anticipate there. But it's still hiding in that yod. So Vayehi, and he was, is how that begins. And then you have your subject, which is typical for Hebrew. In this case, it is Hevel. That's the Hebrew for Abel. So Abel and Abel was, and then you have Ro'e Tzon. Ro'e Tzon. Ro'e, a shepherd or herder. Tzon, notice these are two nouns in immediate sequence. So this is a construct relationship, a herder of sheep. Or you can simplify that just to say he was a shepherd. Okay? So, and Abel was a shepherd. That's the idea of the first clause that we're talking about. Notice this is a typical sequential clause. All right? It's the typical sequence that we expect. Vav consecutive attached to a preterite that dominates the Hebrew narratives. But then the next clause is what interests us, because it talks about Abel's brother. And it says, V'kayin, this is the name Cain, V'kayin and Cain, Haya, there's the verb Haya. This one is should be more familiar. V'kayin Haya, and Cain was Oved Adamah. Oved Adamah. And Cain was a worker. That's the sense of Oved here. It's from that verb avad, to serve or to work at something. And then Adamah, you should know, ground. So he was a worker of the ground. In other words, he was a farmer. That's the idea. So notice what's happening between these two clauses in verse 2 of chapter 4. Vayehi Hevel Ro'e Tzon. Abel was a shepherd, a herder of sheep. And then the next clause, down here at the bottom, the next clause begins not with another Vayehi, which would simply be translated as and Cain was, but this time disjunctive phrasing is used. Remember, disjunctive phrasing is the same thing as a disjunctive clause. It's when you put the vav attached directly to something that is not a verb. In this case, it is once again a noun. And the effect is more than simply just to say, and Cain was a worker of the ground, but rather it is contrastive. And this is what I was talking about. So another use of disjunctive phrasing, or then another use of a disjunctive clause, is to give contrastive information. So we could say this is a contrastive phrase. And in this sort of a case, you might already be going there in your minds. The natural way to translate this idea is, and Abel was a herder of sheep, but Cain was a worker of the ground. Do you see what I'm saying? It's the idea that Cain's profession is being set up in contrast, hence the name contrastive clause, in contrast to his brother's occupation, to what Abel was. Okay, so this is another use of disjunctive phrasing or disjunctive clauses. So let's review. You can use disjunctive clauses to give background information or parenthetical information, and you can also use it to create contrast, to give an idea that contrasts a strong but, in other words, with something that directly preceded it in the narrative. And once again, just like with all disjunctive clauses, it takes the reader out of the flow of the narrative for a moment. It arrests the reader's attention, because this is not the typical word order in Hebrew. It is not typical in biblical Hebrew, especially biblical Hebrew narrative, to begin a clause with a noun and then the verb. As I hope you remember from last semester, the typical Hebrew word order is verb, subject, object. But disjunctive clauses change that kind of ordering up, and frequently you see the subject followed by the verb and then the object, like we're seeing here. All right, so that's another use. And then there is yet another one that we can point to, which we call a circumstantial clause. This would be a clause that fills you in on something happening within the same context of the verb in the preceding clause, something that is attendant to the same idea. So again, this is called a circumstantial clause. And for this one, I'm going to use the one that Ross uses in his grammar for circumstantial clauses. We're going to use the example from Genesis 18, verse 1. Vayera elav Adonai, which would mean then, there's that vav consecutive again, then the Lord, there's our subject as the third word in, the Lord appeared to him. This is a strange form of the verb that we're going to talk about later this semester. I don't want you to get hung up on that. It is related, it's from the same root, zra'ah, to see, but in this case it's a verb that basically means to be seen or to appear. So then the Lord appeared to him. The him in this narrative is Abraham. All right, now I'm going to skip a few words that Ross also includes and get to the disjunctive clause, which is of interest to us. And the disjunctive clause begins, V'hu Yoshev. V'hu Yoshev. All right, and then the rest of it is, he was sitting at the entrance to the tent. V'hu, remember who is the pronoun, the personal pronoun he. He Yoshev. This is the call active participle. I hope that form looks familiar to you. It has the cholam and the tsere in it. V'hu Yoshev. The who here is Abraham, once again. And if you were to look at this literally, you would translate it as, and he was sitting. But remember, what would arrest the Hebrew reader's attention would be that combination of a vav attached not to a verb, but to another element. In this case, to a pronoun. All right, so this, again, seems very natural to English speakers, but this is less natural in Hebrew. And that's what grabs the reader's attention and tells them, oh, this is a disjunctive clause, and there must be some reason for that. Now, in this case, you can always try the different sorts of disjunctive clauses in terms of translation to see if they work. And usually that's the best way to determine for yourself which one it might be. See which one sounds most natural. So, for example, you could try a background or parenthetical version of this. Let's try that out. And the Lord appeared to him. Now he was sitting at the entrance to the tent. Okay, that could potentially work, but perhaps it's a little jarring. Let's try the contrastive clause. All right. So, in other words, let's try this with but. Then the Lord appeared to him at the oaks of Mamre, but he was sitting at the entrance to the tent. That doesn't make sense, right? There's no reason to introduce that contrastive conjunction but in English, because this is not being contrasted with anything. But let's try the circumstantial reading. Circumstantial, remember that it's some other verb, some other event that is happening at the same time as the first main verb that was introduced. In this case, vayera. So that's our main verb. Then the Lord appeared to him. And since this is a circumstance at the same time, we would say the Lord appeared to him while he was sitting. So often you might treat a circumstantial clause by translating it while he was sitting. Sometimes you don't even need that. You could say the Lord appeared to him, he sitting at the time. That's another example you could go with. But either way, the idea that's communicated in English translation to reflect the Hebrew sense here is that this is something in the same circumstance as the first verb. That idea of he appeared to him. In what kind of context? In what circumstances? Well, he appeared to him while Abraham was sitting at the entrance to his tent. All right, so this is an introduction to disjunctive clauses. I realize this may be a tricky one, especially as we begin our second semester to get used to. It's a refresher, among other things, for a number of other topics we've covered in our first semester. So I hope this is coming back to you. And let me encourage you, though it feels daunting at first, this is one of those things, those pieces of grammar that will come with practice. So make sure that you practice the exercises well and pay attention to that question. Which kind of disjunctive clause might I be dealing with in any given situation? And that will determine how you should translate your disjunctive clauses.